In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Most kids learn that little rhyme to remember the important fact of Columbus's discovery, but 1492 was an important year for lots of reasons, and a lot of those reasons centered around what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula, or what we now call Spain. At the time, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, devout Catholics, often nicknamed the Catholic monarchs, were conquering regions throughout the Iberian Peninsula in order to unite it to a unified Catholic country. And in 1492, the last Muslim strongholds surrendered to them in the city of Granada. That was the same year they financed the first voyage of the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus, and it ultimately resulted in the discovery of the New World, which were claimed for the Spanish crown. Something else happened in 1492. A new pope was elected, also from the Iberian Peninsula, or what we call Spain, Rodrigo Borgia, who took on the name of Pope Alexander VI. And if the name Borgia sounds familiar to you, it might be because Showtime recently did a historic drama about his life. And when Showtime does a series about a pope, it's probably not because he's virtuous. That doesn't make for interesting television. Borgia, or Pope Alexander VI, was certainly interesting. He's best known as a cunning statesman. In fact, his ability to play politics and make deals likely led to him becoming pope in the first place. What he's not known for, however, is morality. The Borgia Pope, as he's sometimes referred to, had a number of children by a number of women, and nepotism and simony were some of his greatest tricks. After Borgia's death in 1503, his rival and successor, Pope Julius II, ascended the throne. On the day of his election as Pope, Pope Julius II declared, quote, "I will not live in the same rooms as the Borgias lived. He desecrated the Holy Church as none before," end quote. The Borgia apartments that Pope Alexander VI had commissioned with elaborate frescoes remained sealed until the 19th century. Needless to say, the papacy, and Rome by extension, had a real moral problem and desperately needed reform, and it would ultimately lead to Pope Julius II convening the Church's 18th Ecumenical Council, the Fifth Lateran Council. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. A huge thank you for taking the time to join me today in this series on the 21 Ecumenical Councils, and an enormous thank you to those of you who support Why Catholic. Remember that Why Catholic is 100% supported by listeners like you. Yes, you, even you. And if you're not a supporter yet, I would love for you to become one. It's super simple to do. Just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe to get started. Enough chit-chat. Let's dive in. One of the things that has happened with these councils is that they've started to spread out. If you've been following along, you may remember that sometimes the councils seem to happen every century or so, and then sometimes there's a flurry of councils back to back. For example, once the councils started meeting in the West in 1123 with the First Lateran Council, there were 7 that met within 200 years. You'll also recall that the Council of Constance felt that the ecumenical councils needed to be more frequent, every decade in fact, but that just proved to be an impossibility. For one, putting on these councils was a lot of work. There was a ton of prep work involved to set the agenda, get the right leaders in place, get the council primed to head in the right direction, and not get derailed by some fringe bishops. Then there was the travel involved. Bishops would need to leave their diocese and head to Rome, which could take weeks, if not months, of dangerous travel. And then there were no guarantees as to how long the council would last. It could be months, but in more recent times, councils were lasting longer and longer. The Council of Constance was 4 years, but the Council of Florence was 14. That's a long time to be away from the diocese. And then there's the expense of all of this, the travel, the lodging, the food. All that to say, the Council of Constance's plan of having an ecumenical council every decade proved to be impossible. And now 67 years have passed between the Council of Florence and the Fifth Lateran Council, our topic for today. And a lot has happened in those 67 years. The 100 Years' War between England and France finally came to an end in 1453, thanks to a brave young woman named St. Joan of Arc. That very same year, 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire. In reality, it was the Eastern Roman Empire, the remnant of the vast Roman Empire of antiquity, and it officially came to an end, falling into the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Eastern Christianity would continue, but it would be under Islamic rule, and in many cases, that's still the case today. On the other hand, in Spain, the Christians prevailed against the Muslims, and in 1492, with the fall of Granada, Islamic rule came to an end, and the great Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, ruled a united Spain. And of course, 1492 is another important year because Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. This was the age of discovery. There was a whole other world that nobody in the West knew about, and suddenly the three great Western superpowers, England, France, and Spain, were vying for control. In 1492, conveniently, a Spanish pope was elected, Rodrigo Borgia, who took on the name of Pope Alexander VI. As I mentioned earlier, he was more of a vicar of Caesar than a vicar of Christ. And if you want to hear more about him, check out episode 112 called Not All Popes Are Saints, where I talk about the worst popes in Catholic history. His death in 1503 gave way to his rival becoming Pope Julius II. He sought to take the papacy, Rome, and the Catholic Church in a different direction. I think it's so important to understand, at this time in history, England, France, and Spain are Catholic countries. The state and the church are very much intertwined. Clerics sit in the courts with the monarchs, and going to war against one of these other Catholic nations meant killing other Catholic Christians. Soldiers would wake up in the morning, attend Mass, pray the Rosary, pray the Liturgy of the Hours, and then they would, in the spirit of political domination, take arms against someone who did the very same thing, each having crumbs of the Eucharist still embedded in their teeth. How tragic. And it shows that the world was shifting from seeing itself as a Christian world fighting against a Muslim world to a Christian world fighting for the interests within its political borders. So much so that the very authority of the Pope was being undermined. Many of the papal alliances died with the Borgian Pope, which meant Pope Julius II had a full plate of political conflicts. The Republic of Venice, for example, was appointing its own bishops. The French King Louis XII demanded that Florence, which was part of the Papal States, swear allegiance to France. Pope Julius was doing everything to keep the Italian peninsula, which was primarily made up of papal states, free from outside control, and to do so, he was making anti-French alliances with countries like Spain and England. France, meanwhile, maybe hadn't gotten the memo that the Avignon papacy and its lengthy history of French popes and French influence had come to an end. At the synods of Orleans and Tours, the French church leaders decided that the church had gone too long without an ecumenical council, and so they decided to convene one in Pisa in 1511. Pope Julius II, who had promised to convene an ecumenical council upon being elected pope, quickly declared the Council of Pisa to be schismatic and instead declared that one would commence the following year in 1512 at the Lateran Basilica. And that's what happened. In May of 1512, the Fifth Lateran Council began, and it proved to be a rather small council. Only 100 to 150 attended. It would meet in 12 different sessions, and each session issued a papal bull where the Pope declared something with the approval of the council. As you'll see, the sessions first occurred close together with small decisions. Then they got further and further apart, and the decrees became lengthier. Let's discuss which each of these sessions decided. The first occurred on May 10th, 1512. Giles of Vierbo, general of the Augustinian order, gave an address chronicling the evils happening in the church. Other administrative tasks were set, scheduled for masses, committees, and so forth. The second session occurred a week later on May 17, 1512. This session condemned the quasi-council at Pisa and nullified any of their decisions. The third session had to be postponed and met 6 months later on December 3, 1512. It condemned a handful of cardinals for their role in the quasi-council of Pisa and labeled them as schismatics and heretics. It furthermore put most of France under ecclesiastical interdiction. We've talked about interdiction previously, but an interdiction is basically one step prior to excommunication. It's refusing to make most sacraments available to a specific region, including withholding worship services and Christian burials. Session 4 was held a week later on December 10, 1512, and like the previous sessions, it took aim at the schismatic Council of Pisa, condemned their decisions, and gave a dire warning to anyone who supported the rogue council. Session 5 occurred a couple of months later on February 16, 1513. This session took aim against simony, especially with respect to the election of the Pope. This was in response to the election of Rodrigo Borgia to the papacy, which some present at the council had aided in exchange for favors and wealth. It declared that if it was discovered that a pope had gained an election by simony, his election would be immediately invalidated and he would be deprived of his rank as cardinal. It further gives immunity to those who break allegiance with the disgraced pontiff. Those who had a part in the simony plot and may have received money or favors would have their possessions and property confiscated and added to the church's treasury. Now, about a week after the fifth session, Pope Julius II died. His successor was Pope Leo X. The sixth session on April 27, 1513, prescribed safe passage for those who planned to attend the council. It protected them in their travel, their residency, as well as in expressing their views. Session 7 occurred on June 17, 1513, and it really wasn't a session. It just simply said that the council would be paused until November, but it really wasn't until December 19, 1513, that Session 8 occurred. This session issued 3 declarations. First, they affirmed the individual immortality of the human soul, condemning as heretical all teachings to the contrary. They required philosophers to reconcile their teaching with the Christian faith, and restricted clerics' study of philosophy unless it is accompanied by theology or canon law. Secondly, they prioritized peace among Christian rulers by appointing papal legates, essentially the Pope's ambassadors to these countries who would advocate for peace. It emphasized the need for unity in order to join together in fighting the Muslims, especially the Turks, for the defense of Christendom. They also dedicated cardinals to be legates to address the heresies that were going on in Bohemia. Lastly, this session pushed forward some moral reforms of the Curia that had been in the works since the time of Pope Julius II. It declared that those officials who were found guilty of violating ethics would be suspended for 6 months, and if they did it again, they would be excommunicated. The ninth session occurred 6 months later on May 5, 1514, and once again, the council issued a couple of bulls, or decrees. The first declares that the gravest threat to Christianity is the destructive wars among Christian princes, and it calls the church to restore peace among Christians by uniting them against the enemies of the faith, particularly the Muslims. The second bull warns that declining discipline and moral laxity threaten grave scandal and collapse, and the council commits to restoring order according to the canons and the practice of the fathers. It establishes strict reforms governing ecclesiastical appointments, age and qualifications of prelates, and it establishes financial safeguards for churches and monasteries to prevent abuse and neglect. The third bull from this session sets strict moral, pastoral, and administrative standards for cardinals, requiring lives of sobriety and modesty, impartial service to justice and the poor, diligent care of their titular churches and benefices, proper governance of households, and faithful residence at the Roman Curia or in their assigned provinces. The last bull from this session mandates moral and religious reform by requiring Christian education of youth, strict punishment of blasphemy, enforcement of clerical chastity, suppression of simony, sorcery, and heresy, and faithful observance of clerical duties such as the divine office. It also firmly defends ecclesiastical discipline and freedom by prohibiting secular influence in church revenues and governance, renewing severe canonical penalties, and binding all officials to observe these constitutions under pain of excommunication. The 10th session occurred exactly 1 year later, on May 5, 1515. The first bull mandates, like the previous one, religious reform through Christian education of youth, harsh penalties for blasphemy, enforcement of clerical chastity, suppression of simony, sorcery, and heresy, and strict observance of clerical duties. The second bull seeks to curb abuses by strengthening the authority of local ordinaries, regulating jurisdiction over exempt clerics and officials, limiting appeals to Rome, and ensuring discipline is enforced to prevent scandal and disorder. It also firmly defends ecclesiastical liberty against lay interference in church property and ecclesiastical matters. The third bull deals with printing of books. Now, mind you, that this was right around the time of the invention of the printing press. The bull praises printing as a powerful aid to learning and evangelization, but warns that it has been abused to spread doctrinal errors, moral corruption, and scandal. To prevent this decree requires that all books receive prior ecclesiastical examination and approval before printing, imposing severe penalties, including excommunication, fines, and destruction of books on anyone who violates these rules. The final bull from this session formally summons French clerics and lay supporters of French control over the church to appear before the Lateran Council. Fast forward a year and a half to the 11th session, which occurred on December 19, 1516. The first bull affirms preaching as a vital apostolic office, but condemns preachers who spread errors, false prophecies, invented miracles, and personal attacks that scandalize the faithful and undermine church authority. It requires strict examination and authorization of all preachers, mandates adherence to approved doctrine and interpretations, forbids predictions of future events or claims of private revelation without ecclesiastical approval, and imposes severe penalties on violators, including excommunication and permanent loss of the right to preach. The second and third bulls undo some of the French decrees made that tried to give the government authority over the church. And the last bull praises the labors of bishops and friars in advancing the faith, preserving church unity, and guiding the salvation of souls, while emphasizing that their rights and jurisdictions must be respected and exercised in harmony to avoid conflict and maintain order within the church. It prescribes detailed regulations governing the interaction of bishops and friars. 6 months later, on May 16, 1517, the final session of this council occurred. The first decree issues hefty penalties for those attacking cardinals. The second and final decree renews and confirms the reforms, decrees, and acts of the Lateran Council, including measures for church governance, the observance of peace among Christian rulers, and the campaign against the infidels, mandating that all are to be observed without alteration under penalty of excommunication. It closes the council, granting participants permission to return home with plenary indulgences, while urging rulers and the faithful to uphold the peace, defend the faith, and act in unity for the good of the church. One of the benefits of these councils is that they give us insight into the most problematic issues that were facing the church. What were some of the things that we heard over and over in this council? Well, for one, we heard the need to reform the clergy. There was rampant corruption, especially in the form of simony. And then there was a lack of respect for the clergy, and so people were attacking cardinals. And then there were governments like France claiming authority over the church. And on top of all of that, Catholic nations fought each other, killed their Christian brothers, which was paving the way for Islam to continue to grow. This was a really low point for the church, not in every place, but in certain countries for sure. Rome was a mess during this time. In fact, some priests urged their parishioners not to travel to Rome, lest they become scandalized and lose their faith. The council did well to declare the need for a number of moral reforms. However, what a council decrees and how it gets implemented, as we've seen throughout this series, are very different things. How many times has a council declared something, and then the bishops go home, and then nothing gets done, or it seems like the council's work just unravels? All that talk of reform might have been too little, too late. That was the case with the Fifth Lateran Council. 5 months after the council ended, in the town of Wittenberg, Germany, an Augustinian monk by the name of Martin Luther posted his ideas of reform. We know them as the 95 Theses, and it would become a catalyst, not just for reform, but a revolution against the Catholic faith that would sweep through Europe. That's our topic for next time.
Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.